Okay, great. I think we want to be mindful of everyone's time. So folks may keep joining, but this session will be recorded. So for those of you that would like to view it later, you can do so. Good morning to everyone. On behalf of SCAG and our project team, we're really excited to bring to you a first in a series of workshops that we'll be having around development streamlining and associated tools so that hopefully for those of you that are attending, you can benefit from the resources and the topics that we'll be covering over the course of these workshops. My name is Nasha Lalani. I'm an Associate Regional Planner at SCAG and the project manager for this project, along with my colleague, Legion Sun, a Principal Regional Planner who's also joining us today. And I will briefly provide an overview of the project progress so far and kind of our goals and objectives, and then turn it over to the consultant team so they can cover today's topic. So on the next slide, you'll see just, very quickly the project kind of funding and where this project inception came from. This project is funded through REAP, the Regional Early Action Program, which is funded by the State Housing and Community Development, HCD department, and the funds and the grants are managed through SCAG. This project was kicked off in fall of 2021. So some of you that have joined us today may have participated in the initial phases of this project, which included a survey that we deployed early last year to understand, what stakeholders like yourself were really looking for in terms of development streamlining and exemption tools. And out of that survey, we prepared a series of guidance materials that some of you may have viewed on our website. It's currently live, so you can go ahead and go to this URL and you'll see the development streamlining materials and PDFs that we have produced to date. They're right here. You can click through, see the PDFs. We've tried to make them, very user-friendly. We've included checklists. The consultant team has done a very thorough job to cover topics that maybe you or other constituents expressed as areas of interest or maybe gaps in knowledge that they wanted to learn and know more about. So we hope that you'll take a chance to look at our website, maybe after the workshop today, if you haven't already, and see if there are particular topics that interest you. You can find my contact information on the website. We will post it on the chat or, send it to you if you have any further questions. Before I turn it over to the consultant team, I will just reiterate, the purpose of these guidance materials and the workshop today is meant solely to provide guidance. We hope that agencies and entities that are participating in today's workshop will use these materials at their discretion, especially because there are, different governmental and CEQA requirements associated with utilizing streamlining and exemption tools. So the purpose of this information is really for general information and guidance. And with that, I will turn it over to Jean Ward and the remaining consultant team so they can kick us off for our workshop today.
Thank you, Nasha, and good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us today. My name is Jean Ward, and I am the Manager of Community Planning Services at Civic Solutions, and I provide consulting management for long-range planning projects for cities in Southern California. And along with many of us in recent years, I've been focusing largely on housing policy and implementation of state laws related to housing production and streamlining development. And I'll be moderating today's session. Our two main presenters are my colleague at Civic Solutions, Edith Medina. She's a planner and PhD policy researcher with an emphasis on housing policy, affordable housing, and landlord-tenant relations. In addition, we're joined by Margaret Sohagi, managing partner of the Sohagi Law Group, whose practice for the last 30 years has focused on assisting public agencies with land use and housing law, CEQA, and NEPA. And prior to her legal career, Margaret was a practicing planner. Next slide. So as Nasha described, last year, we released a survey as part of this process, asking jurisdictions what areas of housing law they were least familiar with and where you needed more information. And SB 330 and SB 35 were at the top of the list, along with density bonus law. So in this webinar, we're going to be presenting in detail SB 35 and SB 330 and their modifications, along with judicial positions on these housing laws. Since the passing of SB 35 in 2017 and SB 330 in 2019, many practicing planners are really only recently getting to know these laws and navigate how to implement them, as jurisdictions are now seeing more applications being submitted. And although they're several years old, they are not easy to understand and not easy to implement. And as an added layer, newer bills keep being adopted that modify or expand the laws, such as the recent passage of SB 6 in 2022, which allows applicants under certain criteria to invoke the Housing Accountability Act for residential development on commercial properties. So we'll be touching on this briefly in the presentation as well. Next slide. So following this webinar, which again is going to be strictly focused on SB 330 and SB 35, we'll be having a webinar that focuses on density bonus law and a discussion of incentives and concessions and waivers from development standards and the differences between those two things. So that's going to be coming up on April 13th, and registration for that is open now. And then in the following months, we'll be offering additional workshops or webinars that focus on CEQA streamlining. So next slide. So before I turn it over to our presenters, we have just a few housekeeping items, and then we're going to have a quick poll to start us off today. So first, as Nasha mentioned, this presentation is being recorded, and it will be available on SCAG's webpage, so you can watch it later. For the Q&A, please write your questions in the Q&A box during the presentation, and we'll address them after the presentation as time permits. If your question isn't answered and we don't have time to get to it, we will provide all the questions and written responses on the website in the coming weeks. In addition, if you come up with a question after the webinar, something comes to mind later, you can send those directly to Nasha, and her email address is provided. And then finally, we just wanted to note that we'll be following up these webinars with office hours, where you will be able to sign up to discuss more specific situations and questions related to development streamlining. And dates for those and how to sign up will be forthcoming in the next several weeks. So now we just wanted to run a quick poll with a few easy questions related to our topic areas to help our presenters better know where you stand on these types of applications. Note that questions 2 and 4 are optional, as they're tied to questions 1 and 3. They only occur if you say yes to questions 1 and 3. And then question 5, we recently added, now that the so-called builder's remedy has come to the forefront of issues planners are dealing with. And Margaret's going to be discussing this a bit later in our presentation as well. But we wanted to see how many of you are actually kind of facing issues dealing with builder's remedy right now. So we'll give just, this should only take 20 or 30 seconds to answer the poll, and then we'll see where we stand with the poll. We're at about 53% responding, so maybe we'll just give it another 15 seconds, and then Jamie, you can share the results with me so I can, or with everyone, and we can go through those.
Yeah, we're sitting at about 61% right now. It hasn't moved for about 10 seconds.
Okay, 10 more seconds. Get your answers in. They're easy questions. Okay, Jamie, you want to share? Let's see, let me scroll to the top. All right, so has your jurisdiction processed SB 35 applications? It looks like the majority said no, but 45% said no, about 24% yes, and 31% I don't know. For those that have processed them, really mostly between 1 and 5, so they haven't done that many of them. Only 21% had processed 10 or more. As far as SB 330 applications, same thing, about 40% have said no. And again, not that many. Most jurisdictions have only processed about 1 to 5 when they have. And builder's remedy, about 16% are dealing with builder's remedy application requests right now, and about 50% are not, and about 35% I don't know. Okay, so pretty even mix all around. So I think we have a lot to get through in our information. And again, we'll try to answer as many questions as we can at the end. But with that, I'll turn it over to our presenters.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Adit, and I will be going over SB 35 and SB 330. And at certain points, Margaret would also give her input on these, as well as I go through the slides. SB 35 was enacted back in 2017, but as we mentioned earlier, it has been amended several times since then. SB 35 added Government Code Section 65913.4 to the Housing Development Approvals provision. And SB 35 targets jurisdictions that have insufficient progress toward their RHNA goal and or have not submitted their latest housing element annual progress reports. SB 35 projects require that jurisdictions streamline the approval, and they are to be reviewed against objective standards. They are considered ministerial, so that means that these projects are not subject to a conditional use permit. And it's a voluntary program. The applicant can decide to pursue or not, as long as the eligibility criteria are met. SB 35 ends on January 1st, 2026, which is in a couple of years. Some important aspects of SB 35 is that the project approval is streamlined and ministerial, which means that it's not subject to discretionary review or approval. And so if a project qualifies, the approval has to be done within 90 days. For projects that have more than 150 units, it has to be done within 180 days. So there are extremely limited public review opportunities for SB 35 projects because it's ministerial, so that means there are no public hearings required. However, design review or public oversight can be conducted. And the projects are exempt from CEQA because CEQA only applies to discretionary actions. So HCD has published, and they do so, have done it every year, SB 35 statewide determination summary. The last one they published was on last June of 2022, where they determine which jurisdictions are subject or not subject to SB 35 streamlining. And you can see here on the table on the left, for jurisdictions that have met their prorated lower or above moderate income RHNA, then they are not subject to SB 35 streamlining provisions. And if jurisdictions have made insufficient progress towards their RHNA goal and or have not submitted their annual progress reports, then they are subject to SB 35. And we can see here on the table that the majority of the jurisdictions across California state are subject to SB 35. I want to point out to some helpful resources that are available to you, and the links to these resources are included in our guideline that we have created, and it's on page 5 for SB 35 guideline. And so the first one here on the left is the SB 35 Streamlined Ministerial Approval Program. This was last updated on March 2021. It's a lengthy document, but it goes in detail on how to implement SB 35. The second is the interactive map determination. Is a map where you can quickly, if you just want to take a look and see if your city or county is subject to SB 35. This is a quick tool where you can see which jurisdictions have a HCD approved housing element and is subject to SB 35, and also have submitted their annual progress reports. And for those of you who really want to understand how HCD has determined how jurisdictions are subject to SB 35, they have a SB 35 determination methodology and background data as well. So SB 35 projects only apply to certain housing types. One of them is the multifamily housing development, which should contain at least 2 or more residential units. The other is a mixed-use project where at least 2/3 of the square footage is dedicated to residential uses. So all the projects must meet all the objective standards of the planning code at the time that the SB 35 project application has been submitted. And objective standards are those that are required no personal or subjective discretionary judgment, such as objective dimensional requirements. And I want to point out that resources on designing objective design standards are available from HCD. It's a detailed and very helpful resource, and they go over what objective design standards are, any model ordinances. One way to access is to go to the HCD's Housing Planning Hub site, and a link is also going to be provided to you by Jamie in the chat box. SB 35 project does have numerous site requirements, and I'm going to go over each of them. And the first one is that the project has to be an infill development where at least 75% of the perimeter of the site adjoins parcels currently or formerly developed with urban use. This can include parcels separated by a street or highway. Also, the project has to be located on a parcel zoned for or designated by the general plan for residential or residential mixed uses.
Edith, if I could add a little curve there based upon some updates. Last year, November 2022, the legislature adopted SB 6, which is called the Middle Class Housing Act of 2022. And that sets forth a lot of qualifiers, but allows affordable housing in zones that currently allow office, retail, or parking. So when you put these two pieces of legislation together, it now provides the opportunity for SB 35 projects to be located in an office, retail, or parking area, as long as you meet all of the other qualifiers of SB 6. So something to take note of that's new. It is in the legislation.
Right. So before it used to say that it would be zoned for residential or residential mixed uses, and now the zone for office or retail commercial is included.
Yes.
Next is not located in a sensitive environment. So this means that the project cannot be such as examples are prime farmland, wetlands, community conservation plan area, or a habitat for protected species. And then a project cannot be subject to hazardous conditions. This can mean that the project cannot be, for instance, in a very high fire hazard severity zone, or an earthquake fault zone, or a floodplain, or a floodway. I know we've had a lot of rain, and there have been some properties affected by the rain and floods. The next is the no demolition of residential units. The project cannot demolish housing units that have been occupied by tenants in the last 10 years. And if the units were subject to any form of rent control, or they were subject to recorded covenant, ordinance, or law that makes rents affordable for low-income residents, those units can also not be demolished. And it can also not demolish a historic structure that has been placed on a national, state, or local historic register. And the project can also not be on a parcel subject to the California Subdivision Map Act, unless the development received a low-income housing tax credit or subject to the requirement that prevailing wages be paid. And lastly, the project cannot be within a coastal zone.
So I need to dig in a little bit more to the not subject to hazardous conditions. Like all the other provisions in the Housing Accountability Act and the Housing Crises Act, there are lots of details. So at this point, I want to encourage everybody to, yes, review the summary materials that SCAG has put together. They're an excellent starting place, but they're only a starting place. You really need to read the government code sections that apply. Fortunately, those summary sheets list all the relevant government code sections, so you just need to click on, but it goes back to the old adage that planners need to understand the law. It's particularly true here. So for example, in the instance of this not subject to hazardous conditions, that's a blanket exception that's filled with exceptions to the exceptions, right? Just because this is sausage making in Sacramento. So for example, Adith mentioned the exception of high or very high fire hazard severity zones. There are exceptions there. You can have SB 35 projects within that zone if those sites have been excluded by the local agencies or they've been adopted fire hazard mitigation measures under existing building standards or state mitigation measures, et cetera, et cetera. Read it carefully. There's also further exceptions to the exceptions on hazardous waste, the flood areas, and the floodways and earthquake faults. So got to get to the government code on that. So I'll end preaching on that one.
So we went over the site requirements for this, and there are other additional requirements as well for SB 35 projects. The other is that SB 35 projects have to engage in a tribal consultation. Also for parking, the project needs to have at least one parking space per unit, unless the project is located near public transit or shared vehicle station or historic district, or when on-street parking permits are required. There should also be labor provisions, especially for projects that are greater than 10 units, as prevailing wages should be as well. And also by that we mean workers must be paid prevailing per diem wages, and there should also be provisions for skilled and trained workforce. On this slide, I'm going to go over the SB 35 application process. There are 5 major steps. The first is that the applicant submits a preliminary application with a notice of intent to invoke SB 35. Once the agency receives it, then they notify and invite the Native American tribes to engage in scoping consultation. If an agreement is reached or there are no responses, then the project can proceed to SB 35 review. If no agreement is reached on the project, then the project is not eligible for SB 35 streamlining. So once it proceeds, then the application gets submitted to the lead agency, and then the agency then determines that if the application is subject to SB 35, they have 60 days to review. If projects are more than 150 units, then there are 90 days. Remember that these are mandatory timelines, and if the agency determines that the application is inconsistent, then they are to request additional information. Then the applicant has to submit the revised application, and then the agency has 60 to 90 days to restart the application. So after it has been reviewed and checked for consistent with objectives, plan, and standards, then it goes through this SB 35 streamline approval, and then the agency has 90 days to do so, where design review and public oversight have to be completed within those days. For projects with more than 150 units is 180 days. So there have been several bills that have updated SB 35. AB 830 and 1174, they both, well, actually, yes, they're both related to modification requests to SB 35 projects. So AB 831 states that modifications for approved SB 35 projects are allowed, and so long as they are consistent with objective planning standards. And so then when that modification request is submitted, the agency then has 60 days to review and 90 days if the design review is required. Also if that, also AB 831 requires that the agency determines that modification request prior to the issuance of the final building permit. AB 1174, which was passed last year, these are for modification requests as well for approved SB 35 projects, and it stated that the time during which the approval will remain valid is extended for the number of days between the submittal of the modification request and the date of its final approval, plus an additional 80 days to obtain the building permit. And if a litigation is filed relating to the modification request, then the time is further extended during the duration of the litigation. So these required extensions apply only for the first request for a modification that's been submitted.
Can I add a little bit on AB 1174? It's packed with several little tidbits. Another one that I thought would be of interest to the group today, whether you're working for a public agency or I know there are some housing developers that are attending this workshop as well. And that deals with the length that the permit is valid. So SB 35 provided that you had approval for 3 years as long as you had vertical construction. 1174 revised that to say your approval is valid for 3 years if the construction activity includes demolition and grading. In other words, it has begun and it is in process. So it is backed up that start point just a tad. And then of course, as you mentioned, 3 years from litigation, this all came about because of the litigation in Northern California, which was the first SB 35 case.
Yeah. And the last bill here listed is AB 2668, also passed last year. It made a series of technical and clarifying changes to SB 35, and that SB 35 is not subject to conditional use permits or other discretionary approvals, and that the local government must approve as long as it satisfies the criteria. And so an agency cannot find a project inconsistent with applicable standards on the grounds that applicable materials were not included. I want to point out that in our guidance materials that are posted on our website, we have the eligibility checklist in the last few pages that you can utilize when you are reviewing SB 35 projects. Now I'm going to go over SB 330. SB 330 established the Housing Crisis Act back and went into effect on January 1st, 2020. And then SB 8, which was passed in September 2021, extended the Housing Crisis Act an additional 5 years to January 1st, 2030. And when the Housing Crisis Act of 2019 passed, it passed to address the housing crisis with 3 aims: to increase residential unit development, to protect existing housing inventory, and to expedite permit processing. Both bills, SB 30 and SB 8, made numerous changes to the legislation, including the Permit Streamlining Act and the Housing Accountability Act. And our guidance materials that we have published is for SB 330. On the second page, you will find a list of key provisions and the government code sections that they are located at. Finally, SB 330 only applies to affected jurisdictions. So any jurisdiction that has a population of less than 5,000 people or are located within an urbanized area are exempt from SB 330. So when reviewing SB 330 projects, they only qualify or apply to housing development projects. And SB 330 or the Housing Crisis Act defines housing development project as residential units, mixed-use development, where at least 2/3 of the square footage is residential, can also be transitional, supportive, emergency, or farm worker housing. SB 8 expanded to include single dwelling projects or ADUs. However, last year, the Court of Appeal ruled that the Housing Accountability Act does not apply to building an individual single-family home. And CEQA and Coastal Act standards still apply to SB 330 projects.
Just a reminder here with that definition of housing development project, pay close attention in each bill as to what the definition is because it changes slightly. So just those are key words for you always to be watching when you're trying to untangle one of your project scenarios.
Yes. So SB 330 introduced a preliminary application. This is the same preliminary application that we use for SB 35 as well. It actually has 17 items and project plans that require applicants to submit at the beginning. HTD has a preliminary application template that you can use. And also the intent of this was to make the development review process faster. When an applicant submits all the 17 required items, then it creates this vested right, which means it locks in the development requirements, standards, and fees. So the cities then are not allowed to apply new ordinances or policies or standards to these applications. And the application is considered deemed complete if it contains all the information that's required by the code. So jurisdictions cannot deny the projects on subjective design standards, and projects, I know it's a repetition here, but they are to be reviewed against objective, quantifiable, written development standards, conditions, and policies. And again, the definition for objective standards, and here I want to point out that the definition in SB 35 is the same and consistent with SB 330, which states that it involves no personal or subjective judgment by a public official and uniformly verifiable by reference to a criterion knowable by both applicants and public official.
And an important second point that we've gotten from the courts here, you probably have heard there was a one case, California Renters Legal Advocacy and Education Fund versus the City of San Mateo. In that case, the court upheld the constitutionality of the Housing Accountability Act. But it was interesting in that case, it made clear that when we're talking about applying objective standards, we're talking about that rule that you must look at objective standards. You can't use subjective standards to, one, deny a project or reduce its density. But the court clarified you can use subjective standards for other reasons. It just can't result in a reduction of density or a denial of the project. So in that San Mateo case that I just mentioned, the issue before the court was a standard that dealt with a step back when you had a height requirements. And the court determined that that was a subjective standard. The reason that was a problem for San Mateo was they used that standard to say the project was incompatible with the standard and therefore denied the project. if they hadn't denied the project or reduced its density, they could still have applied that standard, which was basically an articulation standard. So just keep in mind, we're talking about objective standards in the context of denial or reduction. So if you feel like as planners, you've got two hands tied behind your back, I guess I'm here to tell you, you only have one hand tied behind your back.
Mm-hmm. SB 330 projects do have public hearing limits, and you can only have up to 5 public hearings or similar meetings. And here on this slide, I'm going to talk to you about what counts towards a hearing limit, and we have it here listed what doesn't count towards a hearing limit. So what counts towards a hearing limit is any public hearing, a workshop, or similar meeting held by the city, county, board, commission, council, agency, planning department, or any other committees. And if there are any appeal of those hearings, that's also counted towards the hearing limit. And if a hearing is continued, that continued hearing is counted separately. So what doesn't count towards the hearing limit is the legislative approval reviews. And this can include the general plan amendment, a specific plan adoption or amendment, or a zoning amendment, and any appeal of the approval or disapproval of a legislative approval.
I think this provision has caused a lot of questions and consternation because the statute uses the word hearing. It's obviously that it applies to more than hearing when we're talking about workshops. One question I see raised a lot is, what about a CEQA scoping meeting? Because that is held by the lead agency. It's not on the project, but it's on the environmental document for the project. So I think that's an open question, and I would encourage those of you that work with lead agencies to consult with the city attorney or the county council on that one. I'm hearing opinions that go 180 degrees. There's also the issue of, just practically speaking, if you're a planner bringing forth a project, think back to, is your city council, for example, going to want to hear this in 2 sessions? Because both sessions will count. Remember that if you're going to the planning commission, you still need to preserve the right to appeal for the city council. So it's simple math, but I think some are finding it very frustrating.
Yes, thank you. There's certainly lots of nuances in what a hearing is counted towards. So on this slide, I will go over the SB 330 application process. There are here 5 major steps, beginning with the preliminary application, where the applicant submits all the 17 required items and pays their permit processing fees. And then the agency determines that the applicant submitted all those required materials. Then the applicant has 180 days to submit the full application. These are materials required for land use entitlements. Examples are a development plan or a tentative map, and any other information that's required by the local government with their application checklist. And if during this step, the application or like the number of units, the square footage has changed by 20% or more, then a new preliminary application is required. And so that repeats the process. The next step is when the agency then has 30 days to determine completeness in writing. And so if it's incomplete, the agency then writes a list and notifies the applicant within 30 days. Then the application then is deemed complete when the applicant resubmits. If it's incomplete, the applicant has 90 days to modify. And if application is still incomplete by the 3rd review, then an appeal process has to be provided. And for step 4 is when the application once it's deemed complete, then is reviewed for applicable objective standards. agencies have 30 days to do this. Is more 60 days if the project has 150 units or more. Once the project is approved for this, not approved, if it shows that the application is deemed complete and complies with applicable standards, then you can move on to the next step to conduct the hearings, and which you can conduct up to 5 maximum hearings. If the project is not approved, then the application is subject to judicial review, which is under the outlined in the Housing Accountability Act. And when the projects are approved, then they have to be or begin construction within 2.5 years following the date of the final approval. Now I'm going to turn to Margaret, who will discuss on legislative and judicial positions on housing law.
Thank you so much. I think I have to start by saying that no surprise to all of you that the courts and the Attorney General have been relentless thus far about enforcing these recent housing laws, and I don't see them stopping anytime soon. But I think what we forget is that they don't look just to the substance of the law, but they also look at the intent and the legislative findings that are incorporated into the law. So if you could just turn to the next slide, just for you to see, I pulled out some declarations from the Housing Accountability Act. It is the policy of the state that this section be interpreted and implemented to afford the fullest possible weight in the interest and the approval and the provision of housing. Very serious. The next one takes a little bit of a jab at local agencies. The excessive cost of the state's housing supply is partially caused by activities and policies of many local governments that have what? Limited the approval of housing, increased the cost of land for housing, and required that high fees and exactions be paid to the producers by the producers of housing. So this is something that the courts and the Attorney General are paying attention to. So for example, on the next slide, I pulled out a statement from the court from the San Mateo case that I was mentioning earlier. And I think it's bold and it resonates that the legislature has made it clear that these mandates are to be taken seriously, and that we as local agencies and the courts must interpret them to giving the fullest possible weight and interest in the approval and provision of housing. In other words, when you walk in with a housing lawsuit, you are going to assume that the court is trying to apply the correct standards, but interpreting any gray areas with the idea of providing housing. And I think the last sentence is particularly telling. The Housing Accountability Act is today strong medicine precisely because the legislature has diagnosed a sick patient. I think that's poignant. I know a question came up earlier when we were discussing this quote amongst ourselves. It does beg the question of where does housing and housing policy stack up against other critical policies of a local agency, be they economic or social policies. We certainly know all general plan elements have the same level of dignity. But here you're seeing that these pieces of legislation are elevated. And why? Because as part of these adoptions of the legislation, particularly the Housing Crisis Act, the court has declared an emergency. The legislature. The legislature has declared a housing crisis, and that's the purpose of these. So I would say that housing is going to weigh above many other things. All things may not be equal. So what has happened with all of this as we've progressed through the Housing Accountability Act and the Housing Crises Act? More legislation and more legislation. AB 215 in 2012 significantly expands the Attorney General's authority to enforce housing. It grants the Attorney General to independently send warning letters, but more importantly, to file lawsuits when they see a violation of housing laws. It also grants HCD the power to hire and appoint outside counsel if the Attorney General doesn't take on a matter. And this is different because it used to be, before 215, that the Attorney General only acted when it had a referral from HCD. Now it has independent authority. So what has the Attorney General done with it? If you can move to the next slide, please. The Attorney General has established a housing strike force. And this was the press release from our Attorney General when he founded the Housing Strike Force. And note the last part of that. I am committed to using all the tools my office has available to advance Californians' fundamental right to housing. Next slide. The Attorney General also set up a Bureau of Environmental Justice, which is being used for all sorts of health and safety issues. In our world today, they're using both of these agencies to enforce housing element law. So for example, the affirmatively furthering fair housing provisions and the like. So you will see the brunt of the strike force and the EJ Bureau on a bad day. Next slide, please. There have been examples, and I'll just point out two to you today because there are many more and you're seeing them in the newspaper. The first was a case in Encinitas when Encinitas denied a 277 unit housing project that had some 41 low income units as a part of it. The Attorney General sent a nasty letter and saying, if you fail to approve the revised project, the Attorney General will take prompt action to hold the city accountable. The developer sued the city. They ended up settling on a project that had 250 units, slightly less, but 50 units available for low-income households. Then the other one that has been making the newspaper on a weekly basis, including this morning, I noticed, is the ongoing dispute between the Attorney General and the city of Huntington Beach. Recently, I think it was on March 6th, the Attorney General took the next step of filing a lawsuit against the city of Huntington Beach, challenging their ban on SB 9 and ADU projects, as well as their resolution to not enforce builders' remedies rights. So they went forward despite the warnings from the Attorney General. We now have a lawsuit on the books dealing with that, and it's too early to see where that's going to go. We'll just have to wait and see. But I mentioned builders' remedies, and I thought this was an appropriate time to talk about that, at least what it is, because in fact, builders' remedies is not a term that you will find in the legislation at all. Builders' remedies is relating to a provision of the government code. And what this provision basically says, and this is in 65589.5, that if your city or county has not adopted a housing element that's in substantial compliance with state law, developers may propose housing projects that aren't in compliance with that zoning or the general plan. So the key here is that this is triggered. This is what's called the builder's remedy. It's triggered if, as a jurisdiction, you don't have a housing element in substantial compliance with state law. This is coming to the forefront as we move through the sixth cycle of the housing element. But what is substantial compliance with state law? Ultimately, that is a legal question for the courts to decide. I'm not encouraging any of you to spend time in the courts, but we do as necessary. HCD may render their opinion in a letter, but ultimately substantial compliance with state law is up to the courts to decide. So if you could go to the next slide, I want to just show you where this is encased within the government code section. It's the 5th finding. So if you're going to deny a housing development project, you have to be able to make one of these 5 findings. If you don't have a housing element in compliance with, substantially compliant with state law, you are not going to be able to impose the consistency requirements from your zoning ordinance and your land use designations. You may have other grounds. These are 4 other grounds to deny a housing development project. If you've met or exceeded your RENA numbers for that income group, or there's a specific adverse impact on public health and safety, and there's no way to mitigate that impact. Or for example, the denial is required for some reason to comply with state or federal law, or you're on land zone for ag or reservation preservation, or insufficient water, something that's still relevant. But builder's remedy, that's the finding number 5. And I just wanted to clarify that because people are using the term, and you can do a word search in the legislation, you're not going to find it. So with that, I think it's a whirlwind through these 2 important pieces of legislation. And Jean, I'll turn that back to you.
Thank you, Margaret and Edith, and thank you, everyone. I know that was a lot of information to get through, and we are going to do our best in our remaining time to cover as many questions as we can. But again, if for some reason we don't get to your question today, we have quite a few to discuss, but if we don't get to them today, we will provide written responses, and that will be posted on the SCAG's webpage, along with a recording of this session. So ultimately everything will be answered. So I'm going to kick in and start off with the questions we're receiving here.
Jean, can I just add something?
Yes.
If it's all right. I know Nasha mentioned this at the beginning, but you know, this is when we attorneys get a little bit nervous that we're not here to give legal advice today. If I was to sit down with you and give you legal advice, I'd want to know all the facts. I'd want to make sure I didn't have a conflict. We're here to offer some general advice, and I've got to emphasize, please go talk to your counsel when you have housing questions. So thank you. I feel better now. Go ahead.
All right. So first question we got was related to SB 35. Does this mean that the time on the clock when the application is submitted doesn't start until we hear back from tribes via the AB 52 requirement? Because there's often months before a meeting is scheduled with the tribe, if the tribe does in fact request a meeting.
And why don't I jump in? And I'm Tyson Sahagi. I work with Margaret, and I've been asked to assist in this part of the presentation. So SB 35 incorporates by reference what we all know is AB 52, the tribal consultation process as part of CEQA, and that's Public Resources Code 21080.3.1 and .2. So the tribe does have 30 days to formally request consultation. And if no consultation is requested, then the process should end. But if they do request consultation, you are then in the formal consultation process under AB 52. And that only ends when either the parties agree to measures to mitigate or avoid significant impacts on resources, or the parties acting in good faith concludes that a mutual agreement cannot be reached. I think one of the difficulties that some agencies have as part of this process is that the issue of whether or not there is a significant impact is often skipped, and it simply jumps to a discussion of mitigation measures. So I think that can be a difficulty in the process, but either way, it is kind of the traditional AB 52 consultation process.
Thank you. Okay, quick housekeeping item because several questions have come in again. Will the recording be posted and when will the recording be posted? Yes, it will be posted on the website on the link that's on the screen. And Nasha, can you just chime in quickly? Do you think it will be posted within the next week or so?
Yes, I mean, that's our intent. We're going to do our best to get it up as soon as possible.
Great, thank you, because I have 3 or 4 questions about that. Okay, we received a question curious about the very high fire hazard severity zone provision in SB 35. Would anyone like to offer an opinion on whether they think the exemption based on enactment of state fire mitigation measures, like state or local building code requirements that apply in fire zones, means that projects that apply those measures can move forward? And that is my understanding of the law, that you know, that's a way around projects. Projects aren't necessarily exempt because they're in very high fire hazard severity zones, the hard word to say. And I think Margaret spoke to that a bit in her presentation, so I'll turn that back to her if she has anything to add.
No, I mean, that's my understanding as well. They talked about local and state measures. I'm a little unsure what they're referring to on the local, but clearly I understand the state mitigation measures.
Okay, we have a question about builders remedy projects. Can they be on properties that are not zoned for residential uses? The answer to that is yes. And again, Margaret and Tyson, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Don't have anything to add.
Any zone. They can, my understanding is builder's remedy can apply to any zone. Any zone. Let's see. What happens if the 5 hearing limit is exhausted for a project without the decision-making body rendering a decision?
So I can jump in and someone correct me if they read this differently, but I believe 65905.5 does not specify a remedy. So I think it leaves it a little bit open-ended. That being said, that section does cross-reference the Permit Streamlining Act. So I can see some clever housing developers asserting that the deemed approved provisions under 65956B should be in effect. And there is some case law out there that is suggested you know, project can't be deemed approved when it's subject to CEQA, but we are not in that scenario here. We would not be subject to CEQA if it's an SB 35 project.
I guess the question is who wants to be the first test case on that one? But I can see the deemed approved argument being made and backed up with the legislative declarations.
At a minimum, I think the applicant would be able to go into court and seek a writ forcing a decision to be made, you know, at the next public hearing. But I think, yeah, there's an open question about whether it would be deemed approved.
Thank
Good
you.
question.
Yeah, good questions here. Okay, this question, I'm going to look to my colleagues to help me unpack it a little bit. Can you explain what you mean by public oversight? Does it mean if the Code or Subdivision Map Act requires a public hearing and approval by the Planning Commission, that can be done, but Planning Commission has to use objective standards to approve? Question. This is kind of a multi-layered question. SB 35 does not apply to the Subdivision Map Act, first and foremost. My understanding is that if it does go before Planning Commission for any reason, it still has to be done within the time frame that it laid out. But yes, that always objective standards have to be used.
I would point out it's, you know, this issue may ultimately be controlled by the applicable entitlements. And if it's an SB 35 project, you're not going to be subject to a CUP, and that's normally what necessitates a public hearing. It does allow design review standards, and so I could see there being an interesting scenario where there's a design review process that requires a public hearing. I don't think a lot of them do. So I think that would be an open-ended question. I think, you know, if there's no clear decision after reviewing the law on this, I think, you know, you might hold a public hearing, but ensure that it, everything complies with the process outlined in SB 35, including application of only objective standards.
And Tyson, just to follow up on that, I mean, I think, I'm not certain, but I think where this question might be deriving from as well, and this is how some of my jurisdictions work, is, yeah, they'll have a site development permit that can be reviewed by the planning director under objective design standards, but the planning director can also kick a site development permit up to planning commission for review.
And I think the ultimate question may come down to whether a public hearing is inherently discretionary or not. And I don't know if that's a resolved question at this point.
Right. Okay. Let's see. We answered that one. Okay, what power does an agency have to require an applicant to follow a subjective guideline if they don't have the ability to deny the project based on the applicant following the subjective guideline?
I can take another stab at that one. I think Margaret alluded to it earlier when she cited the California Renters versus City of San Mateo case. The Housing Accountability Act does not preclude the application of subjective standards so long as they don't result in denial or reduction in density of the project. That being said, I could see that being a more complicated question if, say, the project also involves a density bonus, and there are some questions about whether amenities would benefit from concessions and waivers in those scenarios, which might preclude shrinking the size of one of the dwelling units if that's what would be necessary to comply with those subjective standards.
But I also understand the question, and it's a good question. It's a leverage question as well. If you don't have the power to deny the project, what good is the subjective guidelines?
But you can condition it. I mean, you could, as
Yes.
Margaret alluded to, you could say, you would need additional fenestration or setbacks on upper floors. So,
Exactly.
that would be to accomplish the primary goals of a design review process.
Right. So you can still apply and approve the project as long as you're not reducing the density of the project.
Let's see. Okay, and here's a question that speaks directly to the presentation that Edith gave and then Margaret chimed in on. Is a development review committee meeting only between city staff and the applicant, and it's not open to the public? So would that be subject to the 5 public hearing limit?
I would argue no, because it's not a public meeting workshop. I mean, there are lots of consultations that occur between an applicant. There's even pre-application consultations. So I would probably come down on the side of no, but here again, consult your attorney.
And just to clarify, SB 330 applies to all housing development, market rate or affordable. There are not criteria like SB 35 about the living wage, skilled workers, etc.
I think there may be a nuance to that. I think the builder's remedy projects are required to have 20% affordable, very low or low income.
But that's only when they're using builder's remedy.
Correct.
So,
Yeah,
right.
agreed. The Housing Accountability Act in total applies to all housing except for individual homes.
So I mean, for example, in the San Mateo case, that was a 5-unit apartment building. No affordable involved.
Okay, we have a couple questions related to CEQA. We are going to be having subsequent CEQA streamlining workshops, but these questions are as they relate to SB 35. Even though SB 35 projects aren't subject to CEQA, can the applicant still be required to provide the other environmental studies, traffic, for etc., when there might be traffic impacts involved? Chad, do you want to comment on that one?
Sure, I can try to answer that. Hi, everybody. Chad Beckstrom with the SET. And Margaret and Tyson may have some thoughts on this too, but my feeling on this is I would be careful about what studies you ask for. You can certainly ask for studies related to the criteria, the site criteria in SB 35, like the sensitive environments, the hazardous conditions, that sort of thing. I'd be careful about asking for a traffic study or anything else you're evaluating that does not relate to the provisions in SB 35 there.
I think that's right. I mean, I think it's a somewhat complicated question that would require a little bit more in-depth research. I will note that from an requirement to provide application materials, you may be generally controlled by the limitations for the pre-application and application process that generally preclude requiring additional materials that are beyond the scope of a traditional development application.
And we know you've got the checklist that Chad was just referring to, and certainly it doesn't have VMT on it.
And then Chad, just to clarify, CEQA, does CEQA apply to either or both SB 35 and SB 330? It's exempt in SB 35 and it can apply in SB 330.
Correct. Yeah, CEQA does not apply to, I mean, it's a ministerial process under SB 35, so CEQA would not apply. If you cannot meet the criteria, then you're subject to kind of the traditional CEQA approach. And SB 330 just requires the traditional CEQA approach or some other streamlining approach you might use.
Yeah, SB 330 does expressly say that it does not supersede the California Environmental Quality Act. That being said, I could see some interesting arguments if your discretion is so limited that you really can't do anything else with the project, of someone arguing that it should be treated as ministerial. And there's a minor line of CEQA cases that say that if you don't really have discretion to address environmental impacts, it should be considered ministerial.
But takeaway rule is yes, it applies.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, back to builder's remedy here. If an applicant submits a preliminary application for builder's remedy and the housing element is approved, must the city still process the application? And my understanding of this is that you have to have an adopted housing element and one that is deemed substantially compliant. And if it is not a compliant and adopted housing element, then you must process the builder's remedy application. But maybe Margaret and Tyson can chime in on that.
Yeah, I think you've stated the rule, substantially compliant housing element, but the question is, who makes that decision? Is that decision made by the city or the county? Is it made by HCD? Is it made by the courts? So I think a city or county has to make that decision at the outset if they agree with the assertion by the applicant that they have a viable builder's remedy option, because ultimately that is a legal question for the court to make.
I will note, there is some case law out there that says that HCD's opinion is not necessarily the final determination of whether a housing element is or is not substantially compliant.
It's interesting. Okay, still along the lines of builder's remedy. If builder's remedy requires the demolition of a historic resource, is the project still granted the protection of builder's remedy?
This called Stump the Panel. Let's see.
That one requires a little bit of thought. Let's see.
I want to look that one up.
Yeah, we can always come back to that one with a written response. Let's see. Still on builder's remedy. For builder's remedy project with more than 150 units, does a local agency have 30 or 60 days to review the full application submittal?
You want to flash your time, your graph, Adith?
Yes, I mean,
You had a slide that showed that.
yeah, I'm going to go through that slide because I think for me that when I review that is for, hold on.
the preliminary application really is just at the front end, and then you still go through your development application process.
Right, so the full application is when, for SB 330 projects, the application process, the applicant submits preliminary application, and then they have 180 days to submit the full. And for 150 units, this is when they are reviewing the consistency in regards to applicable standards. So 160 days to review if the project is more than 150 units.
So basically after the 30-day period, then planning staff has 30 days to review the application for consistency. If that was the question.
Yeah, the question was for builders remedy projects, and I don't think that applies to here.
Well, if it's builder's remedies, that was the original question. The agency is going to have to make a determination at the outset as to whether it applies or not, or process it through and have the planning commission make that decision.
And I do know some builders remedy applicants have submitted preliminary applications and are asserting that the vesting provisions under 65589.50 vest them with a non-compliant housing element.
Right. That's how the two tie together.
Okay.
Okay, it's still on builder's remedy. This is an interesting question and applies to several cities that I'm working with in the SCAG region. For builder's remedy, there's also some confusing language in section B5B that suggests you can't use the zoning or general plan to deny the project if you have a compliant housing element, but have failed to identify adequate sites to meet RENA. Does anyone have thoughts whether this applies in the case where there's a program to rezone per the identified sites, but the rezoning hasn't happened yet? I mean, my understanding would be if you have an adopted and compliant housing element where you've identified your sites, then builder's remedy could not apply, even if you haven't gone through and done your rezones yet, because you have either a year or the 3 years to do your rezones, depending on if you had your compliant housing element done early enough within the statutory deadline.
That's my read as well, Jane.
Okay.
Because it's an adopted housing element that's substantial compliance with state law.
Okay. Let's see. How can one enforce subjective we talked about enforcing we talked about that one. Okay, to what extent can a developer dodge justifying financial feasibility if required to avoid an objective or subjective standard? This is an interesting question, and I'm not sure I understand it, because my understanding of where financial feasibility has to be proved is once you get into the concessions and incentives or requesting a waiver from the development standards when you're using density bonus law, and that burden, if I understand it correctly, Margaret and Tyson, is no longer on the applicant, but it's on the city now to come back and say, you have to prove to me that if the city thinks that the project is financially feasible. But I thought there was new case law that the applicant no longer has to demonstrate financial feasibility or financial infeasibility.
Yes, that is what I remember as well. And we will be presenting that in the next workshop on April 13th.
Anyways, yeah, so we will have our April 13th workshop. There was another question about that earlier on, is could we talk a little bit about density bonus law? That's what we're going to get into in detail on the 13th. So we're going to save that topic for them. We'll be talking about the incentives and concessions and waivers from development standards. There was also a question about if we could just briefly touch on AB 2011. And so when we started setting up this project, of course, SB6 and AB 2011 weren't in play yet. And so we touched on SB6 a little bit. And SB6 is allows residential development on property zoned for retail and office space without needing a rezoning, and allows project applicants to invoke the Housing Accountability Act to limit local discretion to deny or condition the project. Whereas AB 2011 is similar but different in that it creates a CEQA exempt ministerial approval process for multifamily housing development on a zone where office, retail, or parking are the primary permitted uses. So both SB 6 and AB 2011 are aiming to allow housing production on commercial sites, basically sites that are zoned for commercial uses. And one is allowing the applicant to invoke the Housing Accountability Act, and the other law, AB 2011, is what is creating the CEQA exempt ministerial approval process. So we'll be touching more on that as well once we get into our CEQA workshops. And Margaret, Tyson, or Chad, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, that's good. The legislative, government legislative site always has a good summary under the tab bill analysis. So, if you go to leginfo.legislature.ca.gov, you can pull up any of the bills, and there's a bill analysis tab, as I mentioned, and then there's a today's law as amended. So it shows you where the changes are, and it's a really easy, quick read. And I would encourage you to do so.
Okay, and here's a question that was touched on a little in the presentation. Can you go over again SB 8's inclusion of single-family homes to SB 330 and the latest court or legislative decision that says that it doesn't apply to single-family homes?
Yeah.
So that case basically was a remodel of a single family residence, and the county was imposing certain requirements on it, and the applicant said, no, you can't impose those under the law, and it went up. And even after 330 as modified with 8, the court did a very tortured legislative intent interpretation that went on for pages. And their bottom line was SB 330, SB 8 does not apply to single family residences.
You mean the Housing Accountability Act. I will also note that the court did cite the fact that attempts had been made to statutorily amend the Housing Accountability Act to apply to single family homes, and that those had been rejected by the legislature. So they did consider that when interpreting the law.
Right, that was SB 8, because I did go back and check to make sure that they had embraced the language of SB 8 into their consideration. And yes, they said, we don't care what SB 8 says, we know what it says, and this is what it means.
No, Margaret, there was another previous rejected attempt to amend the Housing Accountability Act itself.
Yep.
Okay, and we're going to stay on the thread of case law here. In the San Mateo case, was the upper floor step back written in such a manner that it was not considered objective, but rather was a subjective code interpretation? I would assume that step back regs are pretty objective, black and white. They usually are. So
no,
can you explain why San Mateo lost the case?
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I got so excited because I have the quote. I can tell you what the provision says. It says, if height varies by more than 1 story between buildings, a transition or step in height is necessary. So you can weigh in whether you think that's objective or subjective. The court decided that was subjective.
And I'll note some of the uncertainty that the court cited was whether that step back required a setback for each individual floor. So just the second floor, or whether it needed to apply to the second, third, and fourth floors. So the court does provide a rather in-depth discussion of why they believed it was subjective, and they noted that it could have been done in a more objective manner.
So if that's making someone nervous about their existing provisions, you might want to look at that case, but I think about revising the language or looking at HCD's guidance on objective standards.
Okay, we have a question. Is a certified housing element considered substantially compliant? Yes.
By HCD, it's considered.
Yes, by HCD.
Doesn't mean a court has blessed it, but
I do think after HCD's approval, there is a presumption of validity that you get under the statute.
yes.
So it is to that extent a safe harbor. But
Okay.
that being said, not receiving that certification, as we discussed earlier, is not outright a lack of substantial compliance. I think the case was the Fonseca case that acknowledged that HCD's review is broader than just statutory compliance.
Okay, are affordable units required to be dispersed and of similar size to the market rate units, or can all affordable units be concentrated into one building?
There is a statute that says you've got to disperse them, but I'm not recalling which one of our options here it is.
And I know, I believe Margaret's correct. I think that would require some additional research. I do know that some local municipalities have included dispersal requirements, and I think, for lack of a better word, they call them the anti-pour door requirements as well.
Yeah, I have
I
seen.
think it's, go ahead.
Yeah, I have seen, I guess, another jurisdictions included into the density bonus law.
That's where I remember it being, is in the density bonus law, but only there. But Jean, we can follow up. I think that's the only place I've seen it.
Okay, we'll follow up, and of course, all these will be answered in writing again, and we'll post these with the recorded presentation. The presentation will probably make it up first, more quickly, and then we'll make sure we take our time to answer everything correctly and get that up hopefully within the next couple of weeks. Let me see, we only have a few more minutes here. I'm just going to scroll through and sort of see what questions I missed.
Jean, there's one question which I think is interesting and good. It's a simple one. Is someone asked, oddly, we have had the question where an applicant is not wanting to process an SB 330 application. Is it always a requirement for any housing or mixed use project? So my understanding with SB 35, it is voluntary, so the applicant can decide if they want to go through SB 35 streamlining. But for SB 330, I do not remember if it's a requirement for all housing development projects.
No, somebody does not have to come in with an SB 330 application.
It would just be the traditional application process.
Right.
Or the preliminary application process.
Right.
Let's see, we've talked about subjective guidelines. We've talked about CEQA.
There's another question. I think the question is relevant here. How do you enforce subjective conditions? Can you hold the approval of a building permit? And I think if you're going to ever impose subjective conditions, you have to make sure that they are in fact feasible and don't result in a reduction in density. But those would be the project's conditions of approval. So I would imagine that you could withhold those permits until they comply with those conditions.
Okay, just a quick housekeeping question at the end. Will you send an email to participants once the questions and responses have been posted online? Natia, I believe you can do that, correct? Just follow up with all the participants and send an email.
I will follow up on that. I don't know if we'll directly be able to send an email because the way we typically market these workshops and webinars are through our newsletters of interested constituents, but we can post on the website. So if folks want to check the URL, they can check there.
Great, thank you. Okay. Let's see, we have one question, SB 35/SB 9. apply in urbanized areas, which were defined in the 2010 census. And I think this is going to be our last question based on the time. The 2020 census no longer uses urbanized areas, urban clusters terminology, and just refers to urban areas. With the 2020 census data released, are we meant to use the newly mapped urban areas instead of the formerly mapped urbanized areas per census, or do we use the maps based on the 2010 census definitions until the statute is amended to reflect the change in census methodology?
I believe this
That's a
first,
good question.
yeah, meant for SB 330 and SB 8, the SB 330 for the affected cities. And I will have to double check and get back, but I do not remember if the HCD has updated their definition of affected cities and counties to the 2020 census. I hope they did.
Tyson, so maybe we'll just pass on this question entirely.
We'll follow up and provide a more complete answer to that one for sure.
Research is required for that question.
Okay, well, since we only, I think we've used up a full hour and a half of everyone's time here. So we will make sure we get this webinar posted shortly. We'll take a week or two to make sure we answer all the questions, and then we'll get the Q&A posted. A reminder that we're going to be coming back on April 13th for a specific discussion on density bonus law, incentives and concessions, waivers, and what's the difference between all of those. And then we'll be very shortly announcing dates for upcoming CEQA streamlining workshops as well as posting dates for office hours where we can be available to answer more questions and discuss more specific situations as well. Nasha, did you have anything to add, or Chad?
No, nothing else from me. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody. We appreciate all the participants we had today and all of the great questions, and we will get these materials up on the SCAG website as soon as we can. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.